Let's move on to some other news as well tonight, because Treasury's decision to scrap Eskom's partial exemption from publicly disclosing irregular, fruitless and wasteful expenditure has been widely welcomed after a gazette published in April drew widespread condemnation as the financially troubled utility is still battling corruption. For more on this, let's speak to Cosatu's parliamentary officer, Matthew Parks, joining us from Cape Town, I believe. Matthew, a very good evening to you. Always good to speak to you. So, has this reversal redeemed Treasury in your eyes?
Yeah, we think it's quite positive. We're quite happy as Cosatu that Treasury listened to the public outcry, listened to the frustrations of Cosatu and other organizations and institutions and so forth, and responded positively and said, no, they hear us and they're going to scrap it. So remember when the Treasury had first announced this thing on a Friday afternoon, and then by the Monday morning or the Tuesday, whichever it was, the finance minister intervened when there was a public outcry and said, okay, let's suspend this thing, let's ask for public comment. They did so. Cosatu and other organizations made the submissions. And so we're pleased that Treasury has shown the humility to say, no, they look, it is in our words, it is a mistaken judgment, but whatever. I think it's a positive when government responds to public irritation and frustration and retracts ill-considered decisions. So that's a good thing, because many other departments in government would often just simply refuse. They would bunker down, they'll come up with all sorts of nonsensical excuses and stories, or just simply ignore society. So it is positive when government says they hear society, they hear the workers, they hear unions, and they're going to respond accordingly. So that's a positive thing. We hope Treasury will go a step further and also reconsider the same exemptions they made to Transnet last year. Though, of course, Treasury might say, well, look, there's one more year left in the Transnet exemptions and so forth. It's academic. But I think the principle is nonetheless that we should not be seeking to play bureaucratic games when it comes to disclosing wasteful, irregular, fruitless expenditure and corruption. Treasury would say, look, they didn't hide it, they just simply didn't put it in the annual financial statements. So that makes it easier to loan money. But nonetheless, we just thought it is an unnecessary distraction. It is not helpful. It sent the wrong message to society, to international investors, etc. And of course, it comes against the backdrop of not just the state capture decade and corruption being part of endemic across society, but also comes against when we were grey-listed by the international community 6 months ago.
Right.
So we can't afford these kind of distractions or optics, to be honest.
Well, despite Treasury now there was the initial backtrack in April on the back of the outrage from Labour and other people, other sectors of society, even with the public input now and what was announced yesterday by Treasury, it is still keen, it says, to review the framework around the reporting of fruitless and wasteful expenditure. Is that necessary for these SOEs?
Yeah. So we have no problem with having a discussion, but what can we do to help make our SOEs sustainable, help them to stabilize, to be rebuilt, etc., help them to be competitive in the market? We do appreciate that our state-owned enterprises are basically companies, and they need to compete in the market, on the economy. And at times they raise frustrations about government processes are quite cumbersome, take very long, when a company needs to be agile. So we welcome such a discussion, what makes sense. But the principle must be that when there's corruption or wasteful expenditure or irregular expenditure, this is public funds, these are taxpayers, workers' monies, and there must be a full disclosure of every single thing which is done incorrectly or against the law. There must be accountability.
All right.
So we can have the discussion about what we can do to help, but also let's not sweep things under the carpet either.
But if Treasury is still saying that further down the line there needs to be a review of the reporting of irregular, wasteful and fruitless expenditure, how far would be too far? Have you as Cosatu been able to formulate a position on that? What is, shall we say, agreeable as far as what can be kept off the books, say, for a specific period, and what should not?
Yeah. Look, as far as we're concerned, every single cent in the public fiscus, including the state-owned enterprises, has to be accounted for. We should not hide a single cent, no matter how inconvenient it might be. And just because we do something in the private sector doesn't mean that it's correct. In the private sector, there is corruption there, but it's swept under the carpet. So it's not exposed to the full glare of public scrutiny. Doesn't mean it's right. We've seen in some companies listed on the stock exchange that these things do happen. We saw what happened with Tonga Hulich not long ago. And because things are swept under the carpet, it comes back to hurt workers, and those companies collapse because of corruption. Workers are dismissed or lose their wages, or it even hurts workers whose pension funds are invested in these companies. So for us, our principle is that everything that is spent it must be disclosed completely.
Mm-hmm.
We might see what is the best reporting format. That's fine. Those are modalities. But the principle is there must be full transparency when it comes to all public institutions, all public funds, and all state-owned enterprises. There shouldn't be an exception. Government shouldn't look for things which are a nuisance to it. If it wants to find ways to give support and provide agility to SOEs, fine. But as long as we retain the principles of transparency and accountability.
You mentioned workers' pensions, and that took me back to the conversation last year where there was an intention or a desire, at the very least, to dip into that as a means to fund some of Eskom's debt. I wonder if anything has turned on that almost a year on, as far as whether it might still happen or if it's off the table completely.
No, look, it's off the table. I mean, there is one of a variety of proposals. Look, government bonds are included in Eskom. So the PIC, which invests the Government Employee Pension Fund, the Employment Insurance Fund, the Compensation of Injury on Duty and Occupational Diseases Fund, which are workers' monies, they have invested in Eskom through government bonds, but they are unique because it's in government bonds. So government stands guarantee to those funds. They indicate upfront as part of their contractual agreement what is the return on investment, etc. And government will ensure those monies are paid. So you cannot risk losing it. In fact, to be honest, those are better investments that you find than in the private sector because there is no guarantee. Money can go up or can go down. It can be lost, and there's nothing you can do about it. Yeah. But in terms of the Eskom debt issue, no, government has responded positively to our call as Cosatu. They've taken 254 billion rand, two-thirds of Eskom's debt, off of Eskom's books. Government is paying for it itself out of the fiscus, so not out of workers' monies. That wasn't necessary and so forth. And I think the modalities also weren't going to work. It was quite complicated. And yeah, so it's not going to happen. But we are pleased because the principle was about how do we give support to Eskom because Eskom was drowning in debt. It had a debt level of 400 billion rand. That money that it could have been using to invest in maintenance, to reduce load shedding, could be used to invest in new generation capacity. It wasn't there because Eskom was paying off debt to lenders. So government has done quite well to say they're taking over two-thirds. And that's a positive thing because that means Eskom's daily cash flow can now be directed towards maintenance, towards reducing load shedding, which will enable the economy to work, workers to earn a salary, we can reduce unemployment and so forth. But the original proposal, no, it hasn't happened and it won't happen.
Matthew Parks, Cosatu's parliamentary officer. Good to have your time. Thank you.